Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, May 18th, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look at the Georgia Senate election in 2026, and what we're looking at today is the lack of an impressive Republican bench as we look to see who will replace Jon Ossoff for the Republican Party should they win the election. But a big, heavy emphasis on the word should, because right now Jon Ossoff is the clear favorite in the 2026 Senate race as Governor Brian Kemp makes the decision to step back and not run for Senate in 2026, likely setting himself up for a future 2028 bid. But this video is not about Brian Kemp, but rather about the Republican Party and its current state, with Representative Buddy Carter jumping into the Senate race right now, and one of the statewide elected officials, Insurance and Safety Fire Commissioner John King, both of them announcing that they are running against Jon Ossoff. Now, this comes as the decision from Marjorie Taylor Greene to not run for Senate as well, as Donald Trump, and we'll talk about this in a future video, as Donald Trump and his allies convince her not to, despite her being adamant and thoroughly convinced that she could defeat Jon Ossoff. The 2026 Senate race is shaping up to be a large failure on the Republican side, as they are unwilling, or not unwilling, but unable, rather, to field extremely talented candidates, or even talented candidates. I think extremely might be pushing it there, but to even field strong candidates to run against Jon Ossoff, which means at this point right now, Jon Ossoff is set to run against two Republicans who look like they probably aren't going to do so well in the general election, as many others who have publicly expressed interest probably wouldn't fare that much better either. Now, the current two set of candidates, like I said, Buddy Carter and John King, are likely going to be joined by those who have already left this as a possibility that they might run for Senate. I don't imagine that there will be a super extensive list of people that aren't included onto the screen right now, but what I do think we might see is, pending a Donald Trump endorsement, we will see how this primary shakes up. Now, Georgia is no stranger to electing Republicans in the past. In fact, Brian Kemp was the prime target for the Senate race because he had been elected most recently in 2022 and in 2018, despite it being a Democratic wave year. And looking at the presidential election results, too, we can see, again, Georgia is no stranger to electing Republicans. Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris in the state by roughly 2 points, defeated Hillary Clinton here in 2016 by roughly 5 points, but Joe Biden actually won Georgia, being the first Democrat to do so since 1992, when Bill Clinton won it in his first bid for the presidency. Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump by a margin of less than 1/4 percentage point in this battleground state. But like I said, and Georgia can prove me wrong in the next election, but Georgia seems to be still, at this point, leaning more towards Republicans than Democrats, at least at baseline. But in the Senate race, it is a unique combination of a strong Democratic contender, Jon Ossoff being a very electable Democrat who holds a high approval rating, and not to mention the fact that his 2020 victory was impressive, no matter how you cut it, being able to take on a Republican incumbent, somebody who was largely heralded as a sacrificial lamb in 2019, went on to win the Senate race in Georgia by a larger margin, might I add, than Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in the state of Georgia. But the point I'm making here is that Jon Ossoff's victory in 2021 and 2020, being able to make it to the runoff election, should worry Republicans for 2026. And they probably should be bringing better candidates than what we have right now. You see, looking at Buddy Carter, the first person, as you can see from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution article, this is a pretty big way that Buddy Carter has brandished himself, and even his political advertisements have leaned very heavily into being very, very pro-Trump. It seems as if Buddy Carter is being advised and campaigned for and by MAGA Republicans who just simply are misreading this moment. Now, I said Georgia is willing and open and, in many cases, electing Republicans, but what I do think we've missed on there that I think is important context is that in the 2024 election, Georgia actually shifted by a lot less than many other parts of the country, and a lot less than many other states that were deemed to be battleground, or at least in some capacity competitive. A good example is neighboring Florida, which shifted 10 points to the right from the 2020 election to 2024. The national average shifted by roughly 6 points to the right. But Georgia only shifted by 2.4%. Texas shifted by 8, Arizona by 6, Nevada by 6, and yet Georgia by 2.4. And it speaks to the fact that although Georgia did vote for Donald Trump and Brian Kemp and Trump in 2016, there is a growing, sizable portion of the Democratic Party or of the population in the Atlanta metro area and across the country that is more inclined to vote for the Democratic Party, and by raw vote number is increasing the number of votes that the Democratic Party is even receiving. Looking at the 2016 election, good example. When Georgia voted for Donald Trump, let me see if I can actually switch over to the presidential here, voted for Donald Trump in 2016. You can see here that once we actually get to it, he won about 2 million votes. In 2020, highest turnout election we've seen since the year 1900, and Georgia having remarkably high turnout. 2 out of 3 eligible voters voted in the election. Point is, Donald Trump got 2.4 million votes. But in 2024, Kamala Harris received more votes than Donald Trump did in 2016 when he won by 5 points. More votes than Joe Biden did in 2020 when he won by 0.25 percentage point. Because Georgia is a growing state in population, turnout is growing higher, and more people are voting for the Democratic Party. Now, Republicans also benefited from the high turnout. A lot of the high turnout came from rural areas as well. But Georgia, unlike many other parts of the country, saw some counties, some very notable counties as well, shift to the left. Take a look at this huge map of red. But down there in Georgia, and in that Atlanta metro area, there's a whole lot of blue. Despite the rest of the nation shifting to the right, there were pockets of Georgia, the pocket that holds 67% of the state's population, shifting to the left. So when I think about 2026 and what the national environment might look like for Democrats, they better bring their A game on the Republican side. Because if they do not, Jon Ossoff will likely win this Senate race, not just by the margin he did in 2021, but by an even bigger margin. This race reminds me of something, and you might remember a race that we covered here on this channel, the 2022 United States Senate election in Georgia, where Raphael Warnock was up for re-election after winning in 2021 by 2 points. He beat Kelly Loeffler, the appointed incumbent Republican senator. He did well in the state. But Republicans knew that in the first term, what they thought was might be the first term, ended up being the only term of the Biden administration, was that those midterms were likely going to be brutal for Democrats. At the time at which they started targeting Georgia, it was the day after the 2020 election. And by the time they had reached Election Day in 2022, Biden's approval rating in the state was negative 15 on net, meaning 15% more of the state disapproved of the job that Joe Biden was doing than approved. Republicans thought this would be an easy target. After all, Joe Biden barely won the state and historically had voted for the Republican Party. So on the Republican side, what did they do? Well, they had a lot of people who were open to the idea of running, but none of them could defeat Herschel Walker, who was the Trump-endorsed candidate in this race. Donald Trump endorsed Herschel Walker, enough so that he felt comfortable enough skipping both of the Republican primary election debates, fielded in a number of high-profile endorsements, and then in the election defeated his opponents with 68% of the vote. The assumption here, and the wrong one, was that Republicans would win this election regardless. It didn't matter who was on the ballot. It didn't matter who they had ran. None of these things really mattered because Biden was down 15 in the state. He had won it by just 0.23%. He probably wasn't going to lose. Republicans probably weren't going to lose Georgia. That was their understanding. They were wrong because the candidate mattered a lot. Raphael Warnock is strong, don't get me wrong, and 2022 didn't end up being as strong of a year for the Republican Party as they had hoped, and this election did, in fact, move into a runoff. But the fact remains that Georgia should have been a Republican flip. Herschel Walker just happened to be the best type of candidate for the Democratic Party, for them to run against. When you take a look at the general election, like I said, anticipation was that Republicans would win it. The anticipation across the board was also that Republicans would win it. When you take a look at the numbers here, it was pretty close. The data had all said that Herschel Walker would win. The polling had moved in a direction that was negative for the Democratic Party, but what we saw was a rejection of Herschel Walker as a candidate. They didn't like the type of rhetoric that he was espousing. They didn't like that Herschel Walker had been not doing a great job in this campaign and had scandal after scandal rise from his family, from those he had worked, people who knew him best, had come to the press and said he cannot be a United States Senator. And I think it also speaks to the fact that we might be seeing a very similar thing happen this time around. When you think about it on the Republican side, and you think about these two candidates, John King, I got to be honest with you, I don't know that much about. But when you take a look at Buddy Carter, where he is right now, the campaign that he is running, as is indicated in this announcement article, he is a MAGA loyalist. He's a MAGA warrior, as they put it, right? This is something that he is giving himself. It's not something based on his voting record. It's not based on what Trump calls him. It is what he decides to run on. And the thing is, when you take a look at the way that he is campaigning and looking at the way that he is approaching this election and approached his elections too in the past, he's an election denialist, right? He's someone who is not going to be the most stellar candidate just simply by nature of not being someone who has ran statewide before. Brian Kemp was there because he was that guy in 2018 and in 2022. No matter how you cut it, he was able to win in both of his elections. Elections where, very possibly, Democrats could have done better with another type of Republican, but Brian Kemp didn't give them that option. That's why he was deemed so electable for this race. That's why the data had said that if anybody was to run against Jon Ossoff to win, it would be Brian Kemp, and everybody else would lose. And what are we seeing? Jon Ossoff 47, Buddy Carter 39. Jon Ossoff 51, John King 38. We're at a crossroads here for the Georgia GOP. And the question is, who do they run for Senate? The problem, the bench isn't strong. They're all bench warmers. I mean, these are all people that you would put on the side and say, if you want to run for state secretary of state, okay, you got it. But everybody else is not going to be in a position where they are well tapped in or tuned in for an election cycle where Democrats are more likely than not going to shift the national average back in favor of their party. Georgia only voted for Trump by 2 points, and in 2018, might I add, Georgia almost went to Democrats in the governor election after Donald Trump had won it by 5. Can you imagine what happens now with a popular Democratic incumbent in another Democratic wave year, after Democrats have already proven they can win this seat because they did so in 2021 and 2022? The circumstances are different, and they're much more beneficial to the Democratic Party. And Republicans right now really seem to be at a loss because nobody wants to work anymore. Nobody wants to run anymore in this race because they're not in a good position to do so. And that is the fundamental problem. The Georgia GOP, from an already difficult, looking bench to pull from. I pretty much just pull a name out of a hat because I think they'd all roughly perform the same, and that is to say that I think they would all lose the election. Jon Ossoff is a stellar candidate for the Democratic Party. Definitely a lot of possibility of upward mobility there, too. Keep an eye on him for 2028. Maybe president, maybe VP, we'll see, right? But I do think that should he win by 5 points in Georgia, he'd be pretty set as an electable Democrat, especially if there's a Democratic governor who can replace the Democratic senator. But again, moving back to this point, looking at the Republican primary, looking at the current state of the race, the GOP's in trouble in Georgia. And it feels a lot like 2022, when we could have said very early on that it was pretty obvious that Raphael Warnock was not going to lose to Herschel Walker. It just took Election Day for the GOP to realize that. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.